Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is our final webinar for our fall semester, which is funded by the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities. Our agenda for tonight will begin with a brief introduction to Zoom, followed by our host, Carl Stauffer, introducing the topic, and also our guest speakers, Barbara and Linda. After the presentation, by our speakers, there will be time for questions and answers, which will be moderated by Carl. Following the Q&A portion, Kajungu Mturi will share a few announcements on our upcoming programming here at the Zehr Institute for Restorative Justice and the Center for Justice and Peace Building. The webinar will then be closed out by Carl. We encourage you to stay for as much of the webinar as you can, but please note that there will be a recording of this posted at the Zehr Institute website and also on our YouTube channel by early next week. There you are welcome to rewatch it again and also share it with your friends. Now about Zoom, if you will acquaint yourself with the Q&A dialog box at the bottom of your screen, Carl will use that to moderate the questions during the webinar. You will see a raise hand feature. Please do not use that. We encourage you to use the Q&A dialog box and send in your questions that way. If you have any technical issues, please send a message to Kajungu or to me, and we will do our best to help you. Again, please use the Q&A dialog box to ask your questions when the time comes, and we are happy to have you here. Welcome very much. Go ahead, Carl.
All right, welcome everyone who is here, and we expect a few more to be joining us. Thank you for being part of our webinar series. We enjoy this opportunity to be able to have such a diverse and meaningful and powerful set of conversations. And this one, our last webinar of the series, as Patience has said, is certainly going to be in the same vein. I'm going to talk a little bit to the topic and then introduce our guest speakers. We're going to be looking at dealing with the past. This entire fall series has been looking, for those who have been part of this series, all four of them will know this, but those who might be coming in for the first time, just to give you a little bit of background, we've been focusing this fall, the last four webinars, on looking at how do we deal with historical harms. Historical harms of many different kinds and maybe of many different times in history. And so we've been looking at various means and mechanisms and ways in which societies, communities, and individuals have tried to deal with historical harms. And this week, we're really pleased to be able to look at what some faith-based practices that are happening. And specifically, we're looking at a case study here in Virginia, which we've been trying to highlight case studies in Virginia, from Richmond, Virginia. This is a case study of the History and Reconciliation Initiative, HRI, at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Richmond, Virginia. And we're really pleased and privileged to have Linda Armstrong and Barbara Holley, both parishioners and leaders of this initiative at St. Paul's, with us to talk a little bit about their experience and to give us a sense of the case study that they embarked on just a year ago or so. And it's a 4-year process that they're moving through. And so it's quite an exciting opportunity to look at one way in which one church in this country is wrestling with the issues of their historical past and some of the harms that emanated from that past. So let me introduce our two guests and welcome Barbara and Linda. Barbara Holley is a retired registered nurse. She has been a member at St. Paul's Episcopal Church since 2003. She's been very active in the Richmond, Virginia area, and through St. Paul's provides many opportunities, has been involved in many of the outreach opportunities at the church, including feeding the working poor, mentoring students at Woodville Elementary School, lay Eucharist ministry, Bible study, youth group, and adult relationships. I'm sure our guests will talk a little bit more about this, but St. Paul's Episcopal Church is right downtown, facing the legislature of the state, the Virginia State Legislature in Richmond. She is currently a member of the History and Reconciliation Initiative Steering Committee and the particular committee on memorials and looking at memorialization as a product of their efforts. With Barbara is Linda Holt Armstrong. Linda is a retired training manager for Virginia Commonwealth University School of Social Work, also in Richmond. She's been an active member of St. Paul's in the Capitol Square in Richmond, as I said, for many years and serves on the vestry. Since 2015, Ms. Armstrong has been chair of the History and Reconciliation Initiative, which might be called HRI from time to time. The program will span 4 years of history research and reconciliation efforts, culminating on the 175th anniversary of the church, which is going to be commemorated November 11th, the year 2020. So they have a long-term view on their work, and we're going to hear more about how they're going to fill that time with this important project. Linda holds a bachelor's degree in social work and a master's in education with a focus on training and adult education. I have been privileged to get to know Linda and Barbara through a number of retreats and seminars that we've been able to share together at St. Paul's. And so it's just a real privilege of mine to turn over to them. And we're looking forward to your presentation. There'll be a time for question and answers, as you've heard from patients. So once we've had the presentation from Linda and Barbara, please keep track of the questions you have, those who are in our audience, and you can write those into the question and answer, the Q&A, at any time and send them our way. And we'll take those questions after the presentation. Barbara, Linda, I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, Linda and I, as Carl, you said, have been on the committee, the HRI steering committee, for 2 years now, since 2016. We planned in 2018 to conclude with a special reconciliation service, November 11th, 2020. That will be the 175th anniversary of the consecration of St. Paul's Episcopal Church. Today, Linda and I plan to discuss the achievements of the HRI work thus far, what lies ahead, the theology, and the literature that inspired and guided our work. In June of 2015, a white supremacist joined a Bible study at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and opened fire, killing 9 adults in the safety of their church. The Reverend Wallace Adams-Riley, rector of St. Paul's Episcopal Church, delivered a sermon the following Sunday about the hate of the shooter and what he represented with his beliefs. Our church had been known since the 1860s as the Cathedral of the Confederacy. Many Confederate elite, including Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis, had worshiped here. In his sermon, the rector asked the congregation, what did our church represent? As the Cathedral of the Confederacy, to present-day Richmonders, to tourists, visitors. He pointed out that the Confederate iconography and memorial plaques in the sanctuary told a history, but what did it say about our present?
Thus began our quest to learn more about our history and to go deeper into what we were going to do about what we represented. I'd been a member of the church since 1995, and I'd never heard it called the Cathedral of the Confederacy, but many, many people had. In August of that year, we set aside 2 Sundays for what we call prayerful conversations. And we hired a consulting firm from Washington, D.C. called Justice and Sustainability Associates. And they came in and worked with groups from 5 to 8 people. Each group had a scribe, and they had specific questions they asked, and everyone could comment. The comments were angry, and the comments were thoughtful, across the board, and what people would say. There was they were all transcribed and then produced so that anyone in the parish could read everything that had been said, and then talk about it. In November of 2015, so it was about 3 months later, the vestry elected, those of you who are not Episcopalian, that is the selecting body, a governing body of the parish. The vestry wrote a letter to the parish with the following quote: "This is an exciting opportunity to dig deeper into our history, to talk honestly about that history, and to engage in a richer conversation about issues of race in our community." Accordingly, the vestry voted to immediately convene a group of parishioners to design a process to change, to engage the congregation in a spiritual journey that involves more extensive knowledge of what we are and what we know, and the role of race and slavery in our history, how we can put our history into a perspective and a context of what that history means to us today. While we do not believe that we should begin to remove all symbols reflecting the Civil War, we are in agreement that all images of the Confederate battle flag will be removed from the church. They were removed, they are in a vault, and we've also promised the parish that we would design an exhibit area where they could be seen. This church gets a lot of tourists, Civil War buffs, and we give tours every Sunday. So our plan is in the future to put them somewhere that people can see them. There's four plaques, I think, were taken down, and kneelers. There was a big kneeler that had Confederate flag at the end of each one. We had a lot of comments and a lot of fear about what would happen to our church. But as time's gone on, things have smoothed out a bit, and people are willing to discuss it and listen to other people, and are beginning to realize what this legacy of racial history does to our present.
We have already begun to work on this through the history and research, the memorials, and the liturgy and music committees. Today, we'd like to talk about the work from a Christian perspective and from a time perspective, evolving theology through the last 173 years. St. Paul's is in downtown Richmond. We are right across from the state capitol. It was consecrated in 1845. When it was founded, the church was in the heart of the city of Richmond, enmeshed in the slave economy of the American South. We have assumed that our church, stucco over brick, was built by enslaved laborers. We can find no documentation or mention of this, but it is very possible, very probable, that enslaved labor was used to build the church. Many contractors who had agreements to build used men that they owned, or they contracted with other slave owners to use skilled laborers within the slave population.
In 1830, the census showed that the Richmond population was about 16,000 people. 7,765 were white, while 6,345 were enslaved black, and about 2,000 free blacks. 20 years later, the population in Richmond was 29,000, almost double. 15,000 were white, 11,700 were enslaved blacks, and about 2,500 free blacks. Evident from these figures is that Richmond's population of free whites and enslaved blacks had doubled in 20 years, but it also reflects this thriving economy that is around the slave culture. There were ironworks, tobacco production, grain mills, and the abundance of labor for all of these things was dependent on slavery. In our research, we found that none of the founding members in our church were slave traders. We expected to find some. The slave traders were not there or not evident. We can't document it. There were some slave holding. Almost everyone in the church owned at least one slave. And there was an average of 9 slaves. Excuse me, a little technical difficulty. Non-slave holders were usually unmarried women or men who lived in a relative's household. They were not the people in Richmond that belonged to St. Paul's were the homes of the elite. If the average number of slaves in each household was 9, that indicates wealth. The number of slaves in the 19th century households during the Civil War, many Confederate officers, including Robert E. Lee and the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, were members and regular worshipers. Several Confederate Army officers and cabinet members were not lifelong members of the church, but had come to Richmond as refugees, or called themselves refugees. They had had homes or plantations in the Northern Virginia area, and they were in fear of the advancing Union Army from Washington, D.C. Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy. St. Paul's was steps from the Capitol and a few blocks from the White House of the Confederacy. Vestry minutes, vestry diary, and personal diaries and letters of that time from parishioners tell us that St. Paul's members were dedicated to the Confederate cause, no question. They were Confederate patriots, as they said. Although before the war, some had been very vocal and dedicated to keeping the Union intact.
The Christian theology at the time taught that whites were the caretakers of blacks. The enslaved population could not make good decisions, take care of themselves, and needed the care of masters and owners. They were of limited intelligence and had little self-control of emotions and morals. Ironic that it didn't occur that the enslaved had terrific self-control in not attacking their owners. Blacks were subject to the guidance of whites, and whites were eager to give instruction in the tenets of morality. There was little thought that emancipation would help the enslaved. After emancipation, slave owners tried to convince their servants that they were better off staying with the owners who would feed, clothe, medicate, and educate them in Christian theology. Education did not include reading and writing. Literacy among the enslaved was forbidden. After the Civil War, there was much energy around the obligation of whites to care for the newly freed blacks. The newly freed blacks did need help. They were illiterate, without homes or income, and were living under a 19th century stereotype. Whites saw helping the newly emancipated as a Christian obligation and a route to heaven. A sermon preached by Reverend Thomas Castleman to masters and mistresses drew on Colossians 3:22. Servants, obey in all things your masters. A common belief at the time was that blacks had a large amount of piety and a wish to learn about Christianity, but could not discern truth or interpret the meaning without the help of the white masters or mentors. This thinking was the basic core of the theology of the lost cause. The accepted theology of the post-Civil War South was that the war was not fought over slavery, but over the rights of states to have sovereignty and maintain its economy. The loss of the war was a disaster for the Southern culture and for the emancipated Black population. Many beloved sons of Confederate families had died in defense of the Southern cause, and it was very difficult for people of Richmond to accept that their lives had been given in vain and their lifestyle gone forever. The theology of the lost cause came to be and was very popular among the Southern whites. The loss of the war was not ordained by God, and the Confederate legacy must be kept alive by Southern white Christians. This did not include inviting freed Blacks to Sunday services. The freed population was encouraged to start churches, and white churches continued to support the Sunday school for the emancipated. First African Church was almost next door to St. Paul's. This church had 1,000 members at the beginning of the Civil War. You can see from the slide the many people that were there. The church was required, however, to have a white minister in charge and present during services. St. Paul's and St. James churches in Richmond helped to establish St. Philip's Episcopal in Richmond and St. Stephen's Episcopal in in Petersburg, Virginia. Both of these churches exist today as predominantly Black Episcopal parishes. First African also exists today as a much smaller church in the north side of Richmond.
As you probably have heard, there's been a big controversy about our Richmond's Monument Avenue, which has about 6 statues of Confederate generals. A big part of the lost cause culture was the veneration of the Confederate dead. The women of St. Paul's were very much involved in raising funds for the statues along Monument Avenue, and which are causing controversy today. They also, women of St. Paul's and women of Richmond, raised money for a war memorial, or the war dead, a memorial to the war dead in Hollywood Cemetery. Thousands of soldiers, Confederate soldiers, were disinterred from Gettysburg and throughout Virginia and battlefields and brought to Richmond and buried in Hollywood Cemetery. One of the best histories and explanations of the lost cause theology is in a book that was recommended to me by the chair of our History and Reconciliation Committee, Dr. Christopher Graham. He's in charge of the History Committee. And the book is Baptized in Blood by Charles Reagan Wilson. If you're interested in a deeper understanding and a more thorough overview of the theology of the lost cause, we recommend that you read this book. It has an unfortunate cover, but it's a good book. The federal occupation of Richmond ended in the 1870s. In the 1880s, in the Diocese of Virginia, the assistant bishop, Alfred Randolph, spoke of his philosophy and theology for Virginia's Black population. Some quotes to explain his perspective. The question of infinite importance to us as it win these souls to Christ through Christian education. He further states his wish for better conditions, but notice in this quote of his remarks are filtered through very brutal stereotypes of the time. If I were a politician, I would advocate education of the colored population on the strong ground for the stability of our political institutions. I would advocate the evangelizing of the race as contributing to national wealth and material prosperity. Christianity and Christianity alone will teach them the divine authority of marriage, the sacredness of property, the purity of their bodies and the control of their bodies, the honesty in their relations with their fellow men, and industry into their common toil, and all the virtues that contribute to the wealth of all nations. They would live in better houses, they would wear better clothes, they would accumulate property which would advance the resources of the state and diminish taxation. They would be better customers of merchants. Their wants would increase through the refining influences of a Christian civilization and thus contribute to the prosperity of the whole community. Let's get the question.
1902, the Virginia Constitutional Convention rewrote the state constitution to disenfranchise Black voters through poll tax, residency requirements, and literacy tests. From then until the 1940s, libraries, parks, hospitals, restaurants, cemeteries, and theaters were all segregated by law. Jackson Ward, which is still a predominantly Black neighborhood near downtown Richmond today, registered voters before the new Constitution was written numbered 2,983. After the new Constitution, there were 33 registered voters in Jackson Ward. In 1928, Virginia anti-lynching law defined lynching as a state crime. There were no more lynchings in Virginia after passage of this law. Between 1882 and 1928, there were 88 lynchings that occurred in Virginia. St. Paul's members have been very progressive for their time. In the 1930s and the 1940s, work was done to enhance working and living conditions for Blacks, open union membership to Blacks, to offer better educational career opportunities for Blacks. However, there was no work to open white neighborhoods to the Black population or to integrate schools. Progressive politics and theology was prevalent. St. Paul's has always been known as a church steeped in outreach. It was one of the reasons, or one of the things that brought my husband and I to St. Paul's, to helping others, to working toward social justice. In the 70s, St. Paul's was active in local politics, ministry to deaf children, public school integration, low-income housing, adequate child care, and also improved health care for those living in poverty for both Black and white. Okay, so we've done history. Now let's talk about the theology of our mission for HRI. We've had many resources in our reconciliation journey. People at St. Paul's have given their opinions, they've argued about their stands, they've examined their own motives, and spoken directly about their opinions, their perspectives, their hurts, risked engaging in honest conversation, which is not always easy to do. Our work at St. Paul's is now to reconcile, to seek forgiveness, to be transformed into a loving and beloved community. When we started this congregational effort, many people asked, what is reconciliation? What are you talking about when you say reconciliation? We sponsored an evening of small group discussions to discern what the reconciliation would look like. For some, the meaning is very personal, and the definition or meaning can change as we work through anger, guilt, becoming reconciled, and being loving to one another. We know it is necessary, but achieving it and describing it can be widely disparate and broader, quite murky. Our effort has been blessed by the number of people who volunteer to research our history and to work to bring our reconciliation efforts to fruition. We plan to establish a reconciliation memorial, to write or commission a litany of repentance, and a music composition celebrating reconciliation.
We've had 8 prayerful conversations, as they're called. They're potluck suppers attended by many in our congregation. We have listened to featured speakers. We've listened to each other. We've been in small group discussions. We remind ourselves to work within our mission statement, which is in light of our Christian faith. We will trace and acknowledge the racial history of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in order to repair, restore, and seek reconciliation with God, with each other, and the broader community. Many stories have been told. People have been willing to tell their stories. And I mean, telling stories always brings better understanding and an opening into the reasons people are here, what makes them tick. Barbara and I have talked about that it's hard to listen to someone's personal story and not love them. The understanding comes from telling the story. My personal story is one of a white Southern girl growing up about 20 miles south of Richmond. the capital of Virginia and the capital of the Confederacy. I remember white and colored restrooms. I remember white and colored water fountains, white and colored waiting rooms in hospitals and doctors' offices and in bus stations. I remember restaurants where black people went to the back of the business to order food to take out, but were not allowed to sit in the restaurant and eat it. My school was completely segregated until I was probably in the 8th grade. I rode a school bus to school past a black school to get to my school every day. There were cultural rules and taboos centered on separating the races. But I never asked or wondered why these rules existed. At some point, I was told or I deduced that these rules existed because I was better than these people. I did not question it. I did not wonder about it. I accepted it as it was. When I was in the 7th or 8th grade, my school was integrated by a lone 1st or 2nd grade girl. The principal walked that little girl from her school bus every morning to her classroom, and every afternoon he walked her from her classroom to her bus. I remember thinking about how lonely this seemed. No taunts, no conversation, just walking to the bus with a white man in his 50s. She was dressed up and she kept her eyes down. I can weep when I think about the courage it took to send a child to that school and how brave that little girl was. The thought of one of my daughters having to endure this makes me so sad and ashamed that I was a part of that culture. James Finley, a present-day theologian and a clinical psychologist, quoted Thomas Merton as saying, "We are already one." Finley adds, "We just need to start becoming what we already are." I would add that we just need to start acting like what we already are.
I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and although it was not always evident that there were racial issues, I knew that there were. I was raised in the Baptist church, joined the Episcopal Church in 1959 during my college years. And my husband and I married, and my husband and I remained in that church for several years. In 1968, the Diocese of Pennsylvania requested that we merge with a predominantly white church. The church I belonged to was predominantly a Black Episcopal church. And so we merged with that church. Some white members were not accepting of the merger, and it was hurtful at times. My husband, my 2 daughters, and I, in 1975, moved to Iowa. We were there 5 years, and we did make it work. We moved to Virginia in 1980, joined a diverse parish in Northern Virginia. We have remained connected to many at that church, even since moving to Richmond in 2003. My husband and I visited many churches in the Richmond area before coming to St. Paul's. We found a true welcome here, as in Matthew 25, verse 35. I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. We immediately became involved. We were not strangers to racial bias. So in 2015, when St. Paul's looked at its history and considered our future, I was immediately on board to participate. As a process to reconcile and begin the healing process, our congregation at St. Paul's used the Book of Forgiving by Desmond and Impo Tutu. During this time, I learned much about my past history. Telling the story, naming the hurt, forgiveness to self and others began the process of healing and transformation. This book is a 4-fold path for healing ourselves and our world. I am reminded of the hymn, "We are one in the Spirit and one in the Lord." We are connected. If we begin to tell the story, name the hurt, Tutu says, Forgiveness will transform both our story and our suffering. That's on page 113 in the Book of Forgiving. To tell the story over and over helps, but it requires that one have faith that telling the story will help. Trust the practice and hope for healing, forgiveness, transformation. Regaining hope can be just a moment of grace when we know that things are different, that life will go on. There is a new journey ahead. Tutu says in his book, "Let us pause now and listen to what the heart hears. Meet me here, speak my name. I am not your enemy, I am your teacher. I may even be your friend. Let us tell our truth together, you and I. My name is anger. I say you have been wronged. My name is shame. My story is your hidden path. My name is fear. My story is vulnerability. My name is resentment. I say things should have been different. My name is grief. My name is depression. My name is heartache. My name is anxiety. I have many names and many lessons. I am not your enemy. I am your teacher." Let's pause and listen to what the heart hears. Let's just take a moment to be silent while we listen. Please feel free to share your thoughts. I think you can do that through the webinar. Those comments you are free to share.
We'd like to leave you with just one thought that has helped us in guiding what we do next in our path. Being one, having unity, does not mean that we are uniform in our thoughts, our beliefs, or our responses in life. We are sisters and brothers, not twins. If we can remember to love, our relationships will rise above our past and we can reach a higher level of love. That's our quest at St. Paul's, that we remember we are one body, that we take the spiritual practice together. It's not just seeking reconciliation, but seeking reconciliation as a spiritual practice. We thank you for your time. Carl, that concludes what we have.
Thank you very much, Linda and Barbara. We really appreciate your sharing and sharing from the heart. Maybe there's a little bit of time just so that you can help wrap us in. This has been a really lovely, reflective conversation. If either of you would like to comment a little bit more on the structure of your History and Reconciliation Initiative, in other words, the subcommittees and some of the goals and vision out of that, that might be helpful as we enter in. And I'm inviting our participants to continue to think about what questions you have. I think Linda and Barbara are very open to whatever questions you'd like to ask about, their journey so far, and they'll be honest with you on that. So if you could start, either or both of you, to talk a little bit about the actual structure of the initiative and some of the goals and objectives, then we'll also start taking some questions from the participants. Thank you.
As I said, we started out with the two prayerful conversations with consultants outside of the church, listening to what people thought about our past. And in that process, we really learned a lot about our past. We kept saying we don't know what we don't know. And a lot of things came, some good, bad, and ugly things came from vestry minutes and diaries and letters of constituents. We established 3 committees, and I would say that there's probably about 75 to 100 parishioners who are involved in some way or another with this quest. The first, there's a steering committee, of which Barbara and I are both on. And then there's a history and research committee. And they are the people who've been reading minutes, handwritten minutes of meetings, reading letters and diaries. And the Virginia Historical Society and the Library of Virginia have been just invaluable to us. And also, it's really helpful that they're in town. People go and can spend a Saturday morning looking at these things. The other two committees that are working is the Music and Liturgy Committee. One of their parishioners struck a chord with many of us when he said, we shouldn't be the Cathedral of the Confederacy, we should be the Cathedral of Reconciliation. And he also suggested, and we in the vestry accepted, that this committee look for or commission a piece of music of repentance and reconciliation, and that it be played in one of their special services for reconciliation. In the Episcopal prayer book, there is a service of reconciliation for groups. The third committee, oh, and they also want to write a liturgy to go along with that music. The third committee is a memorials committee, and we want to establish some type of memorial art. At first, we were thinking a statue, a wall, a painting, and then as we've met and worked and talked through things, we now think too that it may be better to have some type of intangible memorial that we endow, so to speak, a curator for the Black History Museum here in town, or an internship for someone in African American Studies. But that be the legacy, that it's not something like a statue that never happens again. We also have a small chapel in St. Paul's, and it is used every weekday noon for a Eucharist. It's a very small, charming little chapel. And it's also be suggested that our memorial be to consecrate that chapel as a chapel of reconciliation. They're the three working committees. They report to the steering committee. I'm the chair of HRI, and I report to the vestry on our progress. And sometimes it seems maddeningly slow, and sometimes fractious. It's just like any other, almost like a workplace. Everybody's working hard, everybody's dedicated to the end. And sometimes some people want to move quickly, and some people, one of the favorite things to say on the Memorials Committee is they're waiting for the Holy Spirit. And other committees are saying, quit waiting, we need to know your report. So it's been messy and murky, but we all have the same, we hope for a transformation of our, not just our church, but individuals that can feel better about their past, both Black and white. Confess it, ask forgiveness, hope to receive it, and talk about it some more.
The Memorials Committee actually, for the last several months, have really looked at what this means to each of us, what our past, how it has affected our present, and how we can take that into the congregation at large. We felt that as a committee, we need to look at ourselves first before moving on to the wider congregation. And we started out with a few, and it's gaining membership. Some have, because of work schedules or outside commitments, have dropped off. But we believe that this is how we are including the congregation at large, and will include them in a larger realm. So that's how we've been working and waiting. Linda is right. Sometimes waiting for the Holy Spirit takes a while. You know, when we are anxious to do it yesterday. It seems like when we talk about 1845, and this is now almost 18, come on, let's move, let's go. So it's hard to have patience. I love your name.
This is kind of an aside, really. Carl Stauffer came to St. Paul's last year, I think, Advent retreat. And he did a great job. We had a great workshop. And one of the things we did was an exercise in how to have a hard conversation. And Lee Switz was there, who's not here today, but she's the chair of the Memorials Committee. And she used that and the Book of Forgiveness for everyone on the Memorials Committee to tell their story and to name their hurt if they could, and especially along racial lines. And one of the wonderful things that happened to it is now the Memorials Committee is kind of bonded together, and they're like a club, and hearing each other's stories have become very close. And that was not, the intention was for people to say where they were, but a nice side effect was this bonding of the group.
It was not what I had expected initially. I have done several kneelers for the church, not any with the Confederate flags, but I've done kneelers recently. And it was my intention as a memorial to work on a kneeler. Well, that's not even been close to where we've gotten thus far. It's been more about really coming to grips with who we are, where we've been, and where we want to go. We have 12 Tiffany stained glass windows in the church, and they were all established between, commissioned and hung between 1890 till about 1920. And this was really a big period of lost cause. Many of the memorial windows are to ex-Confederate soldiers, Confederate generals, and two of our windows, one is a Tiffany, is in memory of Jefferson Davis. Actually, it's a pair of windows. It was commissioned by two very wealthy sisters who were members of St. Paul's. And they commissioned them. But what people, and it's Paul before Herod of Agrippa. It's a portrayal of a Bible story. There's another set, a pair of windows that are not Tiffany, and they are dedicated to Robert E. Lee. And that is Moses leaving Pharaoh, the house of Pharaoh, and Moses looking at the promised land and knowing he would never go there. People are often, when we're talking about this with people outside of the congregation, they're surprised when we say the Lee window and the Jefferson window. They think there's a stained glass window showing Robert E. Lee on a horse, but they're Bible stories. All of those stained glass windows are Jesus, New Testament, Old Testament too. So all of them are memorials. That's just something that's been interesting that we didn't think about, that people thought it would be a stained glass window of Robert E. Lee, which actually was in the National Cathedral in Washington, right. And that window's been removed. Yes.
Thank you. There's some questions coming in. I'm encouraging folks to continue to send them in. And I might have some questions to keep fueling the conversation. We're going to take just a few seconds to give you a few announcements, and then we're going to come back to these questions, and that'll give all of you folks on the webinar a chance to write in a few more questions while we make these announcements. So just two announcements quickly, and then we'll be back to the question and answer time.
Thank you so much. And I just want to make two announcements while you are still waiting for your questions. And I just want to remind you, send your questions on Q&A, not on chat box, so the host can see your question. I just want to remind you to save the date for upcoming training. There's a training, it's called Transformative Community Conference Training, and the instructor will be David Anderson Hooker, and it will be on Friday, February 16 to Saturday, February 17, 2018 at Eastern Mennonite University. Please visit our website for more information and registration. The second announcement, I just want to open your eyes and ears to be aware with the coming webinar starting January. This will be winter/spring webinar series. We have 4 webinars are coming, and visit our website for registration and just to get more information. Thank you so much and I'm so happy I'm still seeing some questions. Keep sending some questions so the host can send those questions to our speaker. Thank you, Carol.
All right, we've got some great questions here. Let's get that started, and then some more will come along the way. Jody Geddes asks, in reference to the flag, or flags maybe it was, that you said you have now in storage, Confederate flags, how do you hope to tell a nuanced story of history, once you put them on display? How have you talked about how you might represent a nuanced understanding of that history?
I can answer that, but it really is very tentative. Yes, it's been discussed. We're not even close to a decision. One thing we know we want to do is we promised the parish they'd be displayed, but we want to put with each plaque, a written piece that is contextual, puts it in context of the time and of the context of today. One idea is to have under each plaque pictures of the period, or if there are photographs available of the person who's in memory of, and then talk about the lost cause, but also talk about today. It's been discussed, and people have sketched things, but we're not close to deciding how that'll be done. And displays are to display it well, which we want to do, we found it's very expensive to do. And so we're trying to raise money to be able to do that also. And does that answer your question?
Well, if any other comments that you'd want to make around that would be fine. We can hold that one for a little bit. I think that part of the challenge there is, how do we make sure all the voices of history, history affects many voices, and often we only hear one voice,
right?
The one who writes the history. How do we make sure, there's the other voices that were affected by the very actions of those who wrote history are also represented?
And that's one of the things that we've discussed a lot, is that we have our history, St. Paul's history, is written from a white, wealthy perspective. Our monuments were placed, the families who could afford to have a Tiffany stained glass window installed at St. Paul's in memory of their grandfather. There's definitely that perspective in what we read in our history. Also that we're hearing from our members and visitors and people of color about, why don't you have a stained glass window with someone of color? Why don't forget to put that perspective in? And evidence, as a historian, evidence and documentation is really rare, obviously, of what that would be. I mean, how that felt. There are very few diaries. I don't know, you have something to add to that, Barbara?
Other than this has been an opening, a window for me to know and to be more acceptive, I guess. And so, yes, I would really like, because I do feel very comfortable here at times, I would like to see what that next piece will look like.
There's a writer now working on a small plaque to go beside the Robert E. Lee Memorial and the Jefferson Davis Memorial that puts it in the context of today. It used to be when the tour, we do a tour every Sunday. I think I mentioned that there's some docents who do a tour, and they will say, this window is the Robert E. Lee window. They used to say that. And now we'll say, as we do with the other windows, this is a Tiffany stained glass window portraying Paul before Herod of Agrippa. And then say at the end, it's in memory of Robert E. Lee. Where in the past, it was like, here's the Lee window. where other windows are not like the Brockenborough window, or they're all in memory of someone, but they're referred to by the memorial name, not the biblical scene. But Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis's windows have been referred to as the Lee window and the Davis window. So we weren't trying to put that in context of, the problem we have is, or the challenge we have, is respecting that this is true, what happened here, and the people who were here believed this. They owned other people. This is not a pretty picture from the context of today. But also to remember that from those, that's what we tried to do today, is talk about white slave owners were taught theologically that what they were doing was a route to heaven. They were taking care of other human beings. And not seeing, kind of like my story of not questioning why are these people not allowed in the restaurant. Taking for granted what was told, they were told, and living it. Kind of living in that bubble that you suddenly, your consciousness is raised and you think, wow, yeah, this is wrong.
We've got a great question here, and thank you, Leonard Dow. How has forgiveness and reconciliation processes that you've been going through as parishioners and as congregants, how has that impacted your power dynamics and leadership structures in the church?
You have an answer for it? Well, it has. One of the things that we've just recently lost our rector, and there have been some stories that it was because of our work with History Reconciliation Initiative that older members of the congregation didn't like it. I'm on the vestry, and it's truly not true. It didn't have anything. I haven't had anyone, I'm the chair of this whole thing, so very rarely will somebody come up to me and say, I think what you're doing is terrible. Or it's never happened, not rare, it hasn't happened yet. But the power structure, forgiving and the reconciliation in that process, in that discussion, in that we have one member of our church who's Black, who had left the church and has come back with this History and Reconciliation Initiative, and has expressed freely some anger about the past, which people have been, I think, accepting and realize that this is an acceptable emotion and probably one that he has a right to be angry. I think some white people are afraid that they're going to be shamed. But we've had a lot of people stand up and say, my great great grandfather owned slaves, and our home places of population, plantation, and they struggle with what that history is for them personally. And then there are others who'll say, I didn't have anything to do with it. My grandfather did it, and I didn't do it. So it's varied. But how has it affected the power? I think there's some people who, through their expression of anger, have felt more powerful, and people have listened closely and granted them more acceptance, more, would you say prestige? What would you say? It's not the right word. People listen to this man more. And I think he's freer to talk. We've had people of color in leadership positions in this church for a long time. So we can't credit HRI with that.
Linda's story when we worked on this together and talked to each other about it, her story of how she didn't question what was going on is very similar to my story in growing up in the North. It was the way it was, and so you just kind of accepted it. Being at St. Paul's, I have had people say to me, okay, enough of this, let's just move on. And so yes, I've gotten that. It's just enough of this, let's just put the past to past, it's done, and move on. But in order to forgive, you can't just sweep it under the rug. And so you have to face it. You have to know what hurt and listen and be ready to accept that, yes, I was a part of that. I would not do it if I had known. I think I've learned so much about what I know now today that I didn't know before coming to St. Paul's.
Can you give you an example?
So, still inviting other questions. Please bring them into the chat room. I'm sorry, not the chat room, the question and answer file, and I'll be glad to take them on. While we wait for some more questions coming in, I have a question. What has been the community response from those outside of the church? What kind of responses are you getting? What kind of feedback are you getting? Have you taken this conversation beyond the internal into the public realm at all? And what has been the responses in sort of Richmond writ large, the community writ large?
We have in August, when we had the issues in Charlottesville, I think you may be aware of that. Mm-hmm. We had a night at the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is near here. And that church started around the same time that St. Paul's. And we had several faith-based leaders to speak during that time. The church was packed with both Black and white. We have had community suppers with about 8 churches, mm-hmm. We've had Presbyterian, Baptist, African Methodist, other Episcopal churches that are invited. And we've had dinner with their leaders, actually, together, and had discussions about both paths from both sides of the coin, which has been really a good thing to hear, that it's not just St. Paul's. Mm-hmm. And so that's happened. We've done 2 of those, mm-hmm. and hope that maybe in the future we'll do something else.
And as we've said a couple of times, we are in the midst of downtown, fairly big city, which is, we are surrounded. We're right by Capitol Square, but there are probably 4 or 5 predominantly Black and historically Black churches close by, within walking distance. And they are the people that we've kind of reached out to help us with their history. And one particular church, Mount Zion, has a historian and an excellent history. I mean, they've really kept great records of what they've done, and it's been helpful to us. We've also had dinner with representatives, a historian also from First African Church, which existed antebellum in Richmond. It's now a much smaller church, but they're very proud of their heritage, that they are an old church and existed while their ancestors were still slaves. We have had a lot of local publicity. The presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, which is like the head of the national church, has heard about what we're doing and is going to visit in March to see what we're doing and to learn what we're doing. We've been told we're ahead of the game. It's funny, we feel like we're slowly crawling. And who could possibly be, why could we be ahead of the game? Because it's hard work. And it's good work. I don't have any negative yet. I hope we don't.
And we haven't tired out completely. The Memorials Committee, for a while, in order to get the history of each other's told and listened to, we met probably weekly or every other week, and we'll begin to meet weekly again in January. So it's tough. It's tough work.
And we're now at the point where we're asking about memorials, like people's ideas about what would we do to do a memorial to reconciliation. And as anytime you ask for public comment, I guess we've gotten some great things, we've gotten some funny things, and that's going to be interesting. We're asking for more from the congregation. So.
We've got some great questions that just came in again, so let me take them on. Leonard asks again, you mentioned moving towards becoming beloved community.
Yeah.
Can you define and or what will that beloved community eventually look like in your imagination?
And that is a really great question. The beloved community is something that it's a term that we've used because we had a theme in our church about 2 years ago, becoming a beloved community. And that was that the church itself, St. Paul's, be within itself a community that is a community of love as a Christian, but also outside of their doors, becoming more of a beloved, of loving our community and being a part of that community. We're downtown, and right now the trend for Richmond is lots of young professionals are moving back downtown. They're coming into town, lots of apartments and condominiums in downtown. Then Richmond gained population in the last 5 years. So it's been, it is a wish and a goal to be transformed into being a more loving community and beloved by God, but we are loving of ourselves. And it goes back to that we are one body, I think. We're one with not just our church or our city, but that we transform it to be more of a, if you will, a cosmos even. I mean, that the energy would be wonderful to transfigure this church, really, more than transform. Is that how you understand beloved community? And I think it comes from about 7 or 8 years ago. You could be designated by the Episcopal Church, National Episcopal Church, as a beloved community. But I don't know what those criteria were.
From Michelle Wright, has the church received any threats from white supremacists? If so, how did you handle those or that? And if not, do you anticipate any backlash from white supremacists?
I have worried about it a little bit and anticipated it. There is a committee here at St. Paul's after Charleston that kind of came up with a safety plan. We do not have guards. We do not have police here. We did have policemen at one evening conversation because there had been reporters, and the prayerful conversation in the beginning, we very much believed that it should be almost like a family conversation. We didn't want it in the newspaper. We didn't want reporters there. We wanted people to be free to just say what they believed. Our church is open all day, every day. I think they lock the doors at 5:30. We have to just go on faith that we're safe, and we could be, we could be wrong. I think there's a safety plan, but it's almost like we're going to do the best we can. And hope that doesn't happen.
I'm sure that in South Carolina, in Charleston, in June of 2015, when the Wednesday night service was going on as a Bible study, no one ever dreamed of what would come. The one thing is that since that time, we are aware, very aware, of anger among outsiders. And so we are very conscious of people that come in. As Linda said, we have visitors every day, constantly, and a lot of them are here to see about the Confederacy. And so we don't know what the real motive may be. So we are aware. We're not being silly and think this couldn't happen to us.
I'm one of the tour guides, and one Sunday after I had a man, he's with his family, and he had on a T-shirt that said, it had a Confederate flag on it, and it said the South will rise again. And he never said anything. He followed me around. He never asked a question. And he made me uncomfortable. Maybe it was the T-shirt, but he stared, and I worried about him. I haven't forgotten that. But he didn't ever say anything. He didn't ever make any move, and he left with his family. It was my fear, probably more than his anger, that I was in the room. We had a training here at St. Paul's before the Lee Monument. How long was it? 2 weeks after?
Right.
2 weeks after Charlottesville, there was another rally here in Richmond around the Lee Monument. And there was a training here at St. Paul's on Friday night, the night before the rally, and how to handle this and what to do and to make it nonviolent. And it ended up in that they got a lot of press the week of, but when the rally happened, there were probably 300 people who were anti-protester and probably only about 12 protesters.
Very few.
It was very few. It was a group from Tennessee.
And they have been back in the area since then. But still, it seems like the anti-protesters outnumber them.
Which doesn't mean it can't get violent.
Right.
Sure. Yeah. Wow. No, that's important. Related to this, Jessica Estevez, what training and preparation or sustainable development have you offered your church leaders to engage in this work? In other words, how are you internally capacitating your leaders in this work and leadership?
I think they have been the encouragers of us. I think they've done more training of us than we've done of them. Our leaders are, our priests are very supportive of this work, and are always, in the Episcopal Church, we have a thing called Prayer to the People, and we pray every Sunday for the dead and the sick, and we used to have a prayer for some organization or some ministry of the church. Every Sunday now we pray for history and reconciliation. It's become part of this church, and I think that's so important if it's going to be who we are in the future, that it be somehow culminate in its DNA, so to speak. Our priests and our leadership have been very, very supportive and offered trainings, and we've invited people in to, I don't know, Katrina Brown is from Rhode Island. A lot of people have heard her. I don't know if your participants have heard of her or not. We had her come down. She did a documentary on her family.
Sure, Traces of the Trade.
Traces of the Trade. She showed it and then talked about it, which was great. In the documentary, it shows them having some hard conversations with each other, and with when they went to Ghana. I never forget one scene. A little boy said, "Are you ashamed?" Because they found out their history, their family history. Their family has a lot of wealth, and it's from slave trades.
Yes. Strongly encourage anyone out there who hasn't seen that, who's in the webinar, if you get a chance to watch Traces of the Trade. And if you plug that in, you'll find their website. Powerful stuff. And it's related to Coming to the Table, which is an organization you can also find online, which has a number of really important resources around transforming historical harms. They have a training manual looking at transforming historical harms, helping whole communities or organizations or groups go through a 4-stage process that they use for all of their chapters. And they have, I don't know how many chapters now across the country, but quite a few, where ancestors of slave holders and the enslaved are coming together and having hard conversations around the truth, but also looking at what would it mean to move from the hard conversations and all of that to build relationship and trust, to go to healing, and then to take action together jointly as a community or as a church. So strongly encourage you to look into Coming to the Table. We've highlighted them and put them on our webinars and had various members who represent their work. So this is one of those key resources out there on this very subject matter. In fact,
I watched your webinar.
Go ahead.
I watched your webinar on Come to the Table.
Yes.
And a member of the DeWolf family was one of your speakers.
Yes, Tom DeWolf.
That's the family that we're talking about in Rhode Island.
Right. And Jody Geddes, who happens to be the president of the board right now, is also right here.
And we had a question for you, didn't we, Jody?
Yeah. I've got another question for you right now. We'll take this up to the end. Is there a role for young people in the community and the church when it comes to this work? And what do you think that role is?
Back to, I think it was the previous question. We've had more younger people come to church here since we started HRI. People have come and said, I've heard about your History and Reconciliation initiative, and I thought this would be a good place to come worship. And younger people, to me, maybe in their 30s and 40s. I'm not talking about college students. I'm talking about young professionals with families. And we've tried to also be involved in other things under History and Reconciliation. There's a cemetery in the East End here called Evergreen Cemetery, and it was a black cemetery. Before that, I think it may have been a slave cemetery.
Right.
And it's completely overgrown, just completely unkept. And every Saturday, volunteers show up to clean the cemetery up, and a couple of people from History and Reconciliation showed up for that. Chris Graham, I think he goes 2 Saturdays a week. We also went to, when President Trump did the travel ban from countries that were at the Islamic Center of Virginia here in Richmond, we had a rally, a lot of faith leaders and a lot of people from HRI just to show up, which I also think is a really important part of reconciliation, is just show up, listen, and stay involved.
Wow. That's wonderful. Thank you, both of you. And there would be other questions, I'm sure. One of the stories I love was when you talked a little bit about congregants. Initially, you were bringing in outsiders to talk about the history, and there was a lot of resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And then there seemed to be a shift. And you can correct me if I'm not getting the story right, but there seemed to be a shift when someone said, how about if we train the congregants? One of the folks helping you guys in the facilitation process, let's train the congregants to do their own research on their own families. And that was a real sort of moment of truth-telling for many of the families to come to terms with their own history. I don't know if that's a fair way of discussing that, but I remember that story sticking out to me from hearing from that as you folks talked about the process.
We've been very blessed, really, with our head lead historian is Dr. Ed Ayers, who's the past president of the University of Richmond and a internationally known historian who really kind of specializes in Southern history. And the chair of our History and Research Committee is a guest curator at the American Civil War Museum. And he came to this church because he moved to town and then heard about what we were doing. And he's become one of the leaders in HRI and listening and training. And, you know, I'll mention too, we didn't say in this, we have a very big oral history thing going on.
Great.
We started with older members of the church about what they remembered. But right now we're kind of having oral history events where we put a recorder in the middle of a table and we have contemporaries talking about what it was like at St. Paul's during different periods of time. We had one a week ago. It was married couples who started coming to St. Paul's in the 70s, and how active this church was at the time and how much they were involved in. And that's history that would just kind of, you know, dissolve. It's not in the vestry minutes.
Right. Sure.
You know, so.
Sure. I was also struck, and then we'll move on to our final announcements, but one last thing that I was struck with when I remember visiting, there were many things, but you also uncovered some interesting history about at least one or two women activists really ahead of their time who were part of this congregation, who were speaking out on behalf of people of color, communities of color, I believe, and also around voting rights, suffragette movement.
Mary Cook Munford has a school named after her here in Richmond, and she was in the 30s and 40s. She worked hard for, she believed that unions should be open to blacks. Blacks should get equal pay. She worked very hard for better conditions. We have one of our historians, we laugh, it's not funny, but you know, when we find out that someone did a really good thing, we'll point out, but they never wanted to allow blacks in their neighborhood or blacks in the schools. So we have this thing about finding out we have good people, which we know we do, and we're very proud of Mary Munford. But we always ask the question of this historian. We'll say, well, okay, she did a great thing, but was it for the wrong reason? Because it's easy to start looking for the context of the time, and she did incredible progressive work for her time. And sometimes it's hard not to put the gauge of now on her, and she and others.
Sure. And to hold the complexity of
Right.
doing good things and holding a racist worldview, and
Right.
what does it mean to figure out what to do with that?
Right. Yes.
Thank you very much, Linda and Barbara. Really appreciate your sharing your story, sharing your experience. We've had someone who's left early just now who said, thank you very much. This was very helpful. She was sorry she had to leave early. And so we're excited. And I want to say to the folks out there, St. Paul's has all this on their website too. So if you want to visit their website and find out more information, I'm sure they would welcome that. I'm going to turn it over to Kajungu, take us through a few announcements, and then we'll close our time here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for everyone. I just have a couple announcements to make before we close. We have upcoming training focused, again, this is repetition on transformative community conference training. And instructor will be David Anderson Hooker, February 16 to 17 here at Eastern Maynard University. The other announcement is about STAR, Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience. So please visit our website for more information and the schedule for the next year. Restorative Justice Graduate Certificate. This allows working professional to continue working while completing your studies. It helps you to reflect on your work and increase your knowledge and the skills. And this certificate may be all you need to revitalize your vision and work. Please visit our website for more information and registration. EMU is offering a restorative justice in education, focus on education system, K-12 educators. Please visit our website for more information and registration. And this is a very powerful program, especially when we think about the restorative justice movement to change the system of traditional discipline to restorative justice system in our school. This is an amazing program. So please think about that program. CJP, Center for Justice and Peace Building, we're offering 2 programs, Masters in Conflict Information, and we have a new program, it's called Masters in Restorative Justice. For more information, visit our website and registration for this coming year. And we're looking forward to see many people for this coming year. Last but not least, the Zehr Institute website is available as a source for upcoming events, resources, the schedule, and upcoming webinars. And the repository for past webinars that are linked to YouTube. The recording for tonight's webinar will be available next week by Monday. So please visit our Zehr Institute website or YouTube for this recording webinars today. I want to take it back to Carl for closing remarks.
Wonderful. We want to thank everyone who joined us and invite you to have a great holiday. And we certainly hope you'll join us again in January as we reopen our spring webinar series, spring-winter webinar series. And there's a lot of interesting topics that we'll be looking at in this coming semester. We also want to thank our guests, Linda Armstrong and Barbara Holley. Thank you so much again for sharing your story, sharing this case study. I think this case study is really critical for such a time as this. We're hearing a lot of bad news. We're hearing a lot of things around polarization. It's great to hear folks who are saying, wait a minute, we can make a difference. We will make a difference, and we're going to commit ourselves to go back into the hard conversations of history. We're going to go back and investigate our history to discover what that history is and all the painful parts of it, as well as the good parts of it, and work out something that makes sense to changing the narrative, as well as your identity and vision as a church. And this is an incredible example. And we're both very thankful for you sharing the story. We'll be remembering you and wanting to support you in this process. We thank you for the commitment to do this for 4 years, 5 years altogether. And we wish you the best in this process, and also that this may become a pilot that we can see multiply in other parts of this country. It's a critical conversation. We all know that. I don't think I need to be reminding anyone of that in our current political climate, that we continue to find ways to come together and have these hard conversations and stay in the conversation long enough to come out on the beloved community side.
Thank you very much for having us and giving us this opportunity.
Thank you.
Yes, all the best with your work, and strength and grace to you. Thank you all, and we'll see you in the new year.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.